Hello, and welcome to the first episode of the Behind Criminal Minds podcast. In today's episode, we're going to cover a number of important issues and recent developments on the channel. As many of you know, my most recent and final video of the Chris Watts series was copyright struck. So we're going to delve into that issue, as well as discussing the Chris Watts case, upcoming content, and some behind the scenes as to what's going on the channel currently. But before I get started, I want to take a moment to say thank you. Since starting on the channel, I had an internal goal of eventually getting to 10,000 subscribers within the first year. October of 2023 was our first year anniversary, and we well surpassed that goal. The overwhelming outpouring of support that I have seen from comments, emails, posts, I just cannot thank each of you enough for that support. I recognize that I cannot do this without each and every one of you. So thank you for taking the time to be here, and let's get started. Now, if you're a fan of the channel, you already likely know that my most recent video on the Chris Watts series was copyright struck. Now, a copyright strike on YouTube's platform is a very serious and considerable move by any person, especially in light of the fact that it has a very deleterious effect on your channel. Specifically, that if you were to get 3 copyright strikes, your entire channel is deleted along with all of your videos, posts, anything related to that channel. It's gone. So it's not an exaggeration to say that this is the nuclear option and is generally considered something that is reserved for only egregious examples of copyright infringement. Thankfully, YouTube is a platform that has really begun to advocate for the fair use doctrine. And the fair use doctrine in and of itself allows for a user or a content creator to use copywritten material for the purposes of criticism, critique, or for a transformative purpose. Now, one of the things that I am doing when I'm working on an episode for several weeks or several months is I am ensuring that I am meeting or adhering to those guidelines as set forth by the fair use doctrine. So to have someone copyright strike the video is not only a misuse of that mechanism within YouTube, but is absolutely not within the scope and guidelines of the law, which is precisely why I have hired legal counsel. As of right now, I'm not going to elaborate too much on the legal side of this, but I do want to say this. Critical speech of a public figure is the absolute definition of free speech. It is why our Constitution is viewed as a sacred document within the United States of America and should be upheld regardless of who that speech is coming from. And it's why I say in every single one of my videos that I publish that I will defend my rights to fair use under all legal avenues available. Now, having said that, I am in the process of redoing the entire episode. This is because even if the video is reversed in the next couple of weeks, I don't want to have to consistently have a long, drawn-out legal battle in order for me to have my video finished and published and moving on to the next subject. I was already in the process of working on future cases, so this has completely put a stop to everything, not to mention the incredible cost of hiring a lawyer. I am not a wealthy person and I don't have unlimited resources to handle lawsuits. However, I believe that this is the right thing, that what I presented in that video is not only protected under the law, but is the right thing to do and are the right things to say as it relates to this case. I may be very bold with the way that I present things and the way that I say things, but I am not making statements that are not supported by the facts, that are not supported by receipts, that are not supported by the evidence that I present within the framework of the videos and episodes that I present. Now, unfortunately, taking out the material that was copyright struck fundamentally alters the entirety of the episode itself. So it's going to take some time to redo it in a way that is not only cohesive and makes sense, but will still allow me to present the evidence and facts that I presented in a way that will eliminate the ongoing risk of having further strikes to the channel. So much of what I do on this channel for Behind Criminal Minds is the advocacy for justice. It is bringing forward to the forefront the issues that victims deal with day to day. I am not only trying to shed light on what happens to the victims, but I am also trying to get into the inner workings of the legal process and expose the things that I see plainly and speak plainly about those things. In the Jodi Arias case, I was incredibly harsh in my last episode against the prosecutor. I explained the mistakes that he made in her case, and that was not a popular take. That was a harsh rebuke of the things that he did wrong that allowed for her appeal to be considered by the appellate judges. However, in the Scott Peterson case, I praised law enforcement for what I saw was their due diligence in ensuring that Scott Peterson was held to account. And speaking of Scott Peterson, the Los Angeles Innocence Project recently retained him as a client, and they intend to bring a case forward on his behalf for his innocence. Now, if it isn't already clear, I absolutely think the notion of Scott Peterson's innocence is completely absurd. They are not presenting new evidence or facts that completely counter the narrative that was brought forward by law enforcement. They are simply saying that certain parts of the case weren't adequately explored, which is not an indicator of his innocence. But rest assured, if this case goes to a point where they bring an appeal forward that is considered by an appellate court, I will cover that as well. Here's another example. In the last episode of the Jodi Arias case, I talked about the Chandler Halderson trial, specifically the prosecutor one of the co-prosecutors in the trial. I spent a considerable amount of time talking about what a great job he did in presenting the facts to the jury, speaking in a way that was clear and concise so that the jury could understand the totality of what Halderson did as it relates to his criminality. The point I'm making is I review cases as they are with the facts laid bare in front of me. I do not walk into a case with a left or right-leaning bias. I look at the facts as they exist and make a determination based on those facts. In February of 2023, I had not yet gone down the Watts rabbit hole. I was not yet a member of Watts Island. In fact, there was someone who I worked with at the time who told me that the implication of Nicole Kessinger's guilt was an absurd conspiracy theory, and that anyone who even spoke anything regarding that was an irresponsible dolt who should not be taken seriously. So if I had any bias at all going into the Nicole Kessinger analysis, it was that she was innocent and that all of the people that had brought evidence against her were looking for evidence that wasn't there. In fact, when I downloaded the discovery evidence, I started by simply reading each and every page and writing detailed notes about every single thing that I saw on those pages. By the time I was halfway done with that evidence, I was almost completely convinced that she was hiding something. And by the time I completed the discovery evidence, along with watching the interview tapes, I was completely convinced that law enforcement had dropped the ball based solely on their evidence alone. The first Nicole Kessinger video is somewhere around 2.1 million views now. Cumulatively, they would be at 3 million if the last video is still up. And I have received no less than several hundred comments, including from former prosecutors, criminal defense lawyers, former homicide detectives, current and former people within law enforcement who all say the exact same thing. Each and every one of them say, that law enforcement did not do their due diligence in their analysis of Nicole Kessinger. Which is why when I read the copyright strike and I saw that in the notations of the reason for it was that they were alleging that I had defamed a podcast guest, I thought that was pretty strange to say the least. Because first and foremost, Michael Rourke is not a podcast guest. He is the elected district attorney of Weld County, a public figure who is subject to the same free speech rules and laws that every public official is across the entirety of the United States of America. He is not afforded special dispensation because he goes onto his wife's podcast as a layperson. He is very clearly going onto her podcast as the elected official that he is, which is how it was referenced within the body of her own podcast. Can you even begin to imagine the number of lawsuits that would be filed if the current and former presidents started suing people that say bad things about them online? Just the mere thought of that is completely absurd. Free speech stands at the very heart of what makes the United States of America a great country. Now, all of that to say that I believe that I am standing on the right side of history, that I am advocating for what is right, the truth, and for justice. And at the end of the day, what matters most to me is being an advocate for victims. Now, I understand that there are quite a few people that have not seen the last episode and were not able to make it to the live or watch it before it was taken down. So I will use this as somewhat of a summary of the episode so that you can get an idea of what it was that was so controversial to the Rourkes specifically. At the beginning of the episode, I start off by outlining all of Nicole Kessinger's lies one by one. Now, to be clear, this doesn't even come close to the total number of lies she told. I am simply trying to make it very clear that within the very first hour of her talking to law enforcement, she had already spewed an unimaginable number of lies. Lies that, as we know, were never followed up on or ever called out by anyone within law enforcement. So after we've covered all the ground of all the crazy things she said and then pivoted or changed and then amended or made up new versions of the same story, we move on to an entirely new case. Now, to those of you that saw the episode, it may have been confusing as to, well, wait, why are we learning about this Tina Tournay Sandoval person? Why have we gone on a completely different track on this case about Chris Watts? Now, to those of you who aren't familiar, the case of Tina Tournay Sandoval involves her husband, John Sandoval, who would be eventually convicted of her murder. I go over the whole history of the case. I discuss what she was doing on the day that she went missing. I discuss all the facts surrounding the case, and we come to find out that the person who eventually tries the case against John Sandoval is DA Michael Rourke. Now, John Sandoval is this prolific, horrendous human being who has this long history of stalking women, and not just a handful of women. We're talking dozens and dozens of women, if not hundreds. After he committed the homicide of his wife, Tina Tournay, he moved to Las Vegas, where he would be caught with hundreds of VHS tapes, where he would go around the Las Vegas Strip recording women as I'll just say, peeping Tom. In fact, one of the reasons that his wife Tina was divorcing him was because she was made aware of his quote-unquote voyeurism. She was well aware of the fact that he routinely would see a woman at the store and then begin to stalk them. He would go into their homes. He would steal personal belongings of theirs. This man is a threat unlike anything I have ever seen before. So despite the fact that they don't know what he did with Tina's remains, they have no evidence of a homicide or a crime scene. They have no murder weapon. They have no confession. They have absolutely nothing whatsoever. Detective Michael Peril convinces his personal friend, Michael Rourke, the DA, to proceed with the prosecution of John Sandoval. Now, to be clear, I believe that John Sandoval should spend the rest of his life in prison. But at the time, despite the fact that they did not have the evidence they needed, they proceeded with the prosecution anyway. Now, in the podcast episode, DA Rourke tells the audience that the local police department, the Greeley Police Department, already suspected that John Sandoval had possibly disposed of her remains at a cemetery that he once worked at, where he was a gravedigger. In fact, they knew of the 3 possible grave sites that were open that night that she went, quote unquote, missing, and they could narrow down the 3 possible locations she could have been buried in. He also explains that there's this organization called NecroSearch, and they are this organization that donates their time and resources to use ground-penetrating radar to help find clandestine burial locations from people who have committed homicides, obviously. So a couple weeks before trial, DA Rourke goes to the Greeley lieutenant and says, hey, can I use this organization to search the grave sites to see if she's under any of these locations that he could have buried her? And the guy says, no, it's not in the budget. Which I point out in the episode doesn't really make sense, because if they're donating their time and resources, why would it need to be in the budget? But, clearly this is just a confusing contradiction that doesn't make any sense and is not explained in the episode. So they proceed to trial. They have almost 140 witnesses. It goes on for a full month. They have people testifying at the trial that John Sandoval is this pathological scumbag who constantly and routinely just stalks women of all types, and he absolutely should be held responsible for the death of his ex-wife, Tina Tournay. Well, the jury deliberates for a handful of hours, and they come back and they agree. They find him guilty of first-degree homicide. They eventually sentence him to life in prison. Game over. Let's move on, right? Well, not exactly. During the trial of John Sandoval, DA Rourke had made some pretty egregious mistakes that would later be overturned during the appeal filing of John Sandoval. Specifically, the appellate judges found that DA Rourke's mistakes constituted enough of an egregious error that they completely reversed the conviction and awarded John Sandoval a new jury trial. Now, if it isn't already completely obvious, what I'm trying to do in telling this whole story is I'm trying to set the stage and explain to the audience that there seems to be a pattern of mistakes that have been made, not only with the case at hand, specifically Chris Watts, and specifically Nicole Kessinger, but also prior cases that had just as much of an importance and just as much of a need for justice. So John Sandoval is awarded a new jury trial, and DA Rourke goes in front of the judge with the defendant present and explains to the judge that he needs more time before they can be ready for trial because they have subpoenaed all 6 years of his prison phone calls. Now, allegedly, John Sandoval was always on the phone spilling the beans about all kinds of things that could have incriminated him. And so during this meeting in front of the judge, telling the judge that he's going to listen to all 6 years of this man's prior jailhouse phone calls, a day later, the defendant's attorney calls and wants to speak to the DA. John Sandoval's personal attorney has called the DA and is now wanting to proffer a plea deal in exchange for telling the family where Tina's buried. Now, I'm not some inhuman monster. I understand that in that moment, you have to tell the family, here's what's going on, here are the circumstances. I know that the family must have been overwhelmed with grief and wanting her back home. But at the same time, in the interest of justice, offering John Sandoval a plea deal is one of the most absurd things that I can even begin to conceive, especially in light of his prior history of stalking and threatening to kill so many different women. Not to mention, the family was not in agreement with offering John Sandoval a plea deal. But despite this, despite the fact that they have 6 years of phone calls that could have held John Sandoval dead to rights, where he could have told someone that he buried her in such and such place, and they could have had all the evidence they needed to nail him to the wall, they did, in fact, they being DA Michael Rourke, did in fact offer John Sandoval a plea deal. A plea deal that will ensure that he leaves prison in about 6 years from now. So he tells the rest of the story. He gets John out of jail, and John has to take them to the burial site. And of course, it's to no surprise he takes them to the grave sites of the 3 locations where they already suspected that Tina was. And after he acclimates himself to the area, he finally points to the grave where they had already suspected she was buried. In the podcast, DA Michael Rourke says, "And we made a deal with the devil." And that's why I named the episode A Deal with the Devil, because the deal that they made for information that they already knew ensures that John Sandoval, this convicted murderer, is going to leave prison in a handful of years from now. And again, the whole reason that I'm presenting this information is to establish the fact that law enforcement in this case is not some pristine, absent of error organization, but in fact seems to have a history of making mistakes at very critical moments. But it also speaks to a greater issue within the U.S. criminal justice system, and that is the issue of plea agreements. When I worked in criminal defense for a short time, one of the things that was routinely the most shocking thing about being in that world was the fact that a vast majority of cases never go to trial. In fact, when I met with the attorney, I had asked him how long he had been working within that specific field. At the time, it was over 20 years, and he had only conducted 18 jury trials. Now, he had represented thousands of people over that period of time, but he had only taken 18 to trial. So much of what our modern criminal justice system has turned into is this mass production of plea agreements. It's like district attorneys believe that their job is to negotiate the most harsh outcome and in the form of a plea agreement to avoid the cost to the county, whereas the whole point of the justice system is justice, is it not? So if you have Chris Watts or John Sandoval telling you that they're willing to accept whatever deal you've put on the table, is it more important to get the conviction or to find out the totality of what went wrong in that case, to ensure that there are not any other suspects involved, to ensure that you have looked at the expanse of your case and don't realize that you're standing on top of the grave from information that you've had for 20 years? Listen, I don't pretend to know everything. I'm passionate and I speak with passion because this is genuinely who I am. I really talk like this in my day-to-day life. You can ask my partner. It's exhausting. But don't mistake my passion for arrogance or that I'm somehow saying that my view is the only view. However, when it comes to the matter of justice, I think the issue is clear. If the conviction obstructs justice, then the conviction is unjust. And I understand that that flies in the face of how we operate within the modern criminal justice system. However, I have a retort to that. Hundreds of years ago, our forefathers, as we call them, they looked at the system of governance around them and said, no, we don't like this. This isn't working for us anymore. In fact, this is something that has been happening within human society for hundreds of years. If there is something broken within the system that we've created, then we have a choice. We can either accept it as it is and continue to allow these injustices to go on, or we can change it. Which is why each and every time I read a comment from someone that says, you're wasting your time. Why did you talk about this case? Why are you still talking about Jodi Arias? Why did you cover Scott Peterson? How dare you talk about Darlie Routier that way? Why did you? I am telling you, there has been, for every single video that I have created, there has been some form of harsh criticism from people within the YouTube space telling me that I should not have talked about that case the way that I discussed it. But when I spoke about Andrea Yates and I covered the expanse of what really happened to her, my goal was not to tell people that she shouldn't be held accountable. but rather to humanize her, to show the empathy that she clearly was not given by anyone that did not know the full story of what actually happened. It was to expose how her psychiatrist is responsible for most, in my opinion, of what went wrong, at least pharmacologically speaking. In the very first episode on the channel covering the Jodi Arias case, I began on the very first sentence by calling out a lie. I began the channel by issuing critiques of things that people say or do for the purposes of advocating for justice, and in that case, advocating for Travis. I cannot properly use words to describe the number of comments that I have read from people who absolutely smear Travis, who smear Shanann, who say the most vile things that you could even begin to imagine, blaming these people for their own homicides, telling the world that they brought it on themselves. And yet at the same time, I realize that the reason that I do these things is to make each one of those people more tangible so that we can empathize with what they went through. And in the matter of the Chris Watts case, I truly believe that the only way that we can advocate for the change that we want to see is by first calling out the mistakes that were made and doing so plainly without frivolity and saying things that are sounding like they're so carefully worded. I'm going to speak plainly about what I see, and I'm sorry if that offends people, but I'm speaking from my heart for a reason. In the same episode, I tell the story that I told in the community post that I had posted several months ago about my cousin James and his daughter Allison. Now, I won't retell that story now, and if you haven't heard it, then I will include it in this reworked episode that I'm working on for the final chapter of the Chris Watts series. But to those of you who are unfamiliar, I will summarize this as best I can. James was the youngest of 5 brothers and sisters, and he was a cousin that I was particularly close to growing up. Anytime I came into town, he and I were always together. We were always running around in the arroyos in the back part of my grandmother's house, getting into trouble, doing things that we weren't supposed to do, but having the time of our lives together. And when we got older, I always knew that he would make a truly exceptional father, mainly because I knew that he didn't have the best one. I could see it in his eyes that he wanted to be the best father he could be because he didn't have those things for himself growing up. So years later, when Allison was born, I remember seeing some of the earliest pictures of her and just being completely astounded. Even though they lived in a very small town, she was recruited to be in print ads because of just how beautiful of a child she was. And not just because she was pretty and had a cute smile, but because she was always laughing and playful and just the most joyful, beautiful little girl. Where we grew up, things were tense. There had been a lot of turmoil within the community because of a massive strike that had gone on there. There were 2 predominant communities, religiously speaking, the Mormon Church and the Catholic Church. For the most part, those communities got along, but they didn't intermingle hardly at all. James and my family were Catholics, and his wife and her family were Mormons, devout Mormons who desperately wanted to convert him and his children to their religion. Obviously, James did not agree with this, and despite that, he wanted to have an amicable relationship with his in-laws, particularly the woman that helped raise his partner, her grandmother. Apparently, she was always wanting to take the baby out and offer them parent time alone so that they could have some time to themselves. And on one weekend afternoon, she offered to take the baby for several hours. James wouldn't find out until sometime later that she had something of a drinking problem. And apparently, she had left Allison in the car for 3 hours before someone noticed and before she was alerted to what she had done. This was the middle of July, and there was nothing they could do to save her. To compound the problem, apparently the grandmother began lying about all kinds of things, specifically where she was, why she had forgotten. A whole multitude of problems came out from the very first day that we were notified of all of this disaster. Now, it seemed completely obvious to me that law enforcement would have done some kind of investigation or interrogation or even an interview where they brought her into their department, sat her down, asked her questions, did some sort of testing, because apparently the EMTs who arrived smelled alcohol on her breath at least 3 different times. The responding officer who provided the card to my family would not respond to calls for several weeks, and eventually when he did, he simply stated that they had not done any kind of formal investigation. They were not going to be investigating it any further, and simply told the family that any further investigation would only re-victimize the family and to simply focus on grieving the loss. When pressure was applied, the response was something along the lines of, "We've done our job. You don't know what you're talking about. You're a layperson. Leave it alone. Move on." Sadly, all of that information I found out from family. I wasn't even allowed to be involved in this process. At the time, I thought it would be wrong of me to overstep this familial line and try to push for some kind of advocacy for them to investigate. I thought it was just best for them to handle it and to leave it alone. But every single time that I saw James from that point till the day he passed, it was as though I was watching someone who had died that day. He wouldn't speak to anyone. He wouldn't talk, even when you asked him questions. Even if you said hello to him, he would just sit there and stare off into the distance. I saw firsthand the high price of what happens when law enforcement does not do their job. And the reason that I share that story with you is because I genuinely believe then, as I do now, that so much of what we do and how we respond to these types of cases defines the future for our children and their children. And I categorically refuse to believe that there is nothing that can be done to right these wrongs. And because all of these sentiments are the backbone of who I am as a person and as a creator, it was why I went the way that I did at the words that were spoken by D.A. Rourke, specifically within this podcast. Because when they finally arrive at speaking about the Chris Watts case, they have already been talking about the John Sandoval matter for quite some time. In the podcast episode, he is openly using John Sandoval's name over and over and over again. But once he's asked to start talking about the Watts case, he says he refuses to use his name at all. And at that point, we're told that we shouldn't even use the name of offenders. In the beginning, sure, but not really at all. And there's this whole campaign, I guess, to not even use their names, even though they just did that with the Sandoval case. He then proceeds to tell story after story concerning the Watts case and including rewriting history, which for me was the central reason why I started to talk about this, specifically because of what he was saying. Now, to that point, he had always said publicly that Sandra Ruszczyk had been the one to advocate for Chris to get the plea deal and to not go to death row. But in this podcast episode, he now says that they were split and that she was wanting him to get the death penalty. Now, to this point, I have made less episodes about Chris Watts than I have Jodi Arias. But I have received somewhere north of several hundred comments from people who outright chastise me, who say that my willingness to talk about this case at all is terrible and that I'm a bad person and how dare I speak about it? What kind of person does this? It's pretty shocking, to be honest, how many times I've received comments like that. And yet, from day one, my point and purpose has always been to advocate for justice, to advocate for Shanann and her children. And so to hear the DA now saying this statement about Shanann's parents, which is, in my opinion, and this is my take personally, defamatory in and of itself, I thought that was incredibly hypocritical. He then proceeds to go off on this tangent about how he doesn't listen to podcasts that are monetized or that don't have the victim's permission, which I thought was very odd because he didn't indicate in his interview that he received permission from the Tornays or the Rooschecks to talk about their case. And in the same episode, they read a sponsored advertisement for a brand that they have a deal with. Now, pointing all of this out is an objective fact. I'm not making statements that are declarative, that are not supported by the facts. I'm simply making commentary based on what is factually true, based on their own words, which is why I used the podcast to illustrate that I wasn't simply making accusations that were baseless, but that were based in their actual statements. Now, I had received a comment in one of my recent community posts that I completely agree with. This response, particularly in striking the video in an attempt to silence what I've said in the content of the video, is a very authoritarian style response. There are countries like Russia and China where you are not allowed to make open and free statements without penalty, without repercussions from government officials or from law enforcement. There are not open free speech laws that allow for you to make commentary within the confines of your home freely. And I think we can all agree, regardless of what political affiliation or view that you have, that an attack on free speech, an attack on our fundamental rights to have a dialogue about the things that we see within our elected officials' actions is the very heart of what makes free speech free. Now, over the course of doing the Chris Watts series, one of the most common questions that I had been asked over and over is from people who wanted to know, what can we do? What are the next steps? I would routinely see comments from people saying something along the lines of, where is the, petition that I can sign? What can I do next? If I had to estimate, I've probably seen somewhere between 2,000 to 3,000 of comments just like that on my videos alone. And there's a very specific reason why in this video I illustrate DA Michael Rourke's response to those people and him saying in his podcast that he wants all of us to leave it alone, to not talk about it, to leave him alone. He very adamantly and aggressively tells us to just shut up, leave it alone, don't bother him anymore, don't talk to him about it, don't approach him, even kindly to say, hey, can I take a picture with you? He doesn't want any of that attention. He doesn't want to hear it. He doesn't want to receive emails. He doesn't care about petitions. And that is precisely why I made the video that I made. Because those of us who do see issues within this case need to focus on the future. We need to advocate for what's in front of us. Because that's one thing you can say about the United States, particularly our political system and our judicial system. If you want to see change within that system, then you can work together at the grassroots level and make that kind of advocacy group affect the change that you want to see in the world. What's so amusing to me about the copyright strike is the fact that had they simply ignored it and just not even addressed it at all, and acted like they didn't even know anything about it, they had never heard about it, it would have just gone away on its own. Eventually, like anything else does, it just would have died out. But to do something so, in my opinion, egregious by silencing it, of so many people have commented and have made statements along the lines of the fact that it looks like an attempt to silence the truth. Now, I've purposefully waited to bring this up until this moment for a reason. Now, to this point, I have gone to great lengths to avoid monetizing the channel in really any considerable way. You'll notice that I do not ask people to subscribe. I don't even mention Patreon until the very end of any video that I create. I have been approached by something along the lines of 30 or 40 different companies to put ads in all of my videos, and I've declined so far. Now, to some of you, that's obvious why I've done that. To others, not so much. And here's my personal reason why, to this point, I have not used advertisers or sponsors for my videos. And the primary driving reason for that is because I want my content, specifically the content I've created so far, to be authentic. Now, I will be honest, I may have to accept sponsorship deals in the future, predominantly because of the fact that hiring an attorney is a greater expense than I think most people realize. And that's the sad thing, just defending myself from free speech issues is going to cost thousands of dollars. Now, to be clear, I'm not bringing that up because I want you to do anything. I'm not saying here's my donation page or here's a place where I'm not asking for anything from anyone. I'm trying to illustrate a greater point. My video was a critique of an elected official in the capacity of the district attorney of a county in Colorado. I did not make a single statement that was not backed immediately by either evidence as shown via the receipts that I provide or audio clips that I'm responding to. All of that to say that sometimes doing the right thing is hard. And I'm going to be very transparent right now, which is kind of crazy to say this out loud, but I turned down a $4,000 sponsorship for the video that they copyright struck because I simply believed that it would not look right in the video, especially in light of what I was saying. But I genuinely believe that this is the right thing, that this is the way. This is the right path to speak truth passionately, to advocate for what's right, to advocate for victims, and to stand on the right side of history on these issues. Now, I want to segue into something that for a lot of you, you may not necessarily know anything about, but I think it's important and I want to explain why. As a content creator, I recognize that I am not infallible. I make mistakes. I'm human. I have lived life, and in the course of my life, I've made mistakes in the things that I've done, both as a father and as a employee. I have not always been on the right side of things. But when it comes to these kinds of issues, I take my time for a reason. I can't tell you how many times I talked to my partner leading up to the release of this episode, explaining to her, like, I'm nervous about this. I'm worried about what I'm saying, and yet I would listen to it and I'm like, this is what I believe. This is what I think. This is how I feel. And yes, I understand that there are hard-hitting issues, but it's the truth. Now, here's the segue. I understand a vast majority of people, especially people that follow true crime, may not know anything about this creator. But right now, within the YouTube sphere, there is a creator that is under an incredible amount of scrutiny. The channel's name is Mama Max. And as of right now, this creator is just under an unimaginable amount of scrutiny and is in the process of having a complete collapse as far as the loss of subscribers and the sheer scrutiny that he is currently under. He is a predator catcher kind of channel, and it's very not my forte. I can't watch anything he creates, and that's not a criticism of him. It's just not my thing. Now, here's the reason why I bring this up. Over the last couple of months, he's made a series of mistakes, largely because of something that is very common within the YouTube sphere. If you go to any channel's page and you look at the number next to their name, that number for a lot of creators represents the amount of clout that they believe they have. For some creators, they have millions and millions of subscribers, and it starts to create this belief that because of so many people putting their trust into them and supporting them through Patreon and through accounts where they've got merch and they've got books and they've got all these fans that adore what they say and do, it starts to create this belief that everything they say has value and is important and should be said. When I'm not working on cases and I'm just needing some downtime to not focus on the grim details of what I'm studying, I will routinely watch videos about the rise and fall of specific YouTube channels. Right now, the current controversy is Mama Max, but there have been a number of channels that have at one time been the favorite of the genre that they operated in or within the YouTube sphere as a whole. But somewhere along the line, they allowed their ego, they allowed their own personal view of the things that they say to overwhelm their view of reality. And even though I speak with an incredible amount of confidence, I am far more realistic and humble than I think people may realize. I may be confident in the way that I speak, but truthfully, I second guess everything I do. I am always looking at the counter argument to whatever it is that I'm saying. In fact, when I got the news that the LA Innocence Project had brought on Scott Peterson as a client, I immediately thought to myself, did I miss something? Am I wrong? Did I make a mistake with this one? The point I'm making is I always try to consider that the way that I'm viewing something may have a counter argument that's valid before I present it to you. And if I ever do make a wrong step and I say something that is later proven to be wrong, then I won't hesitate to admit when I've made a mistake, when I have said something that is incorrect. Right now, I'm working on finishing the scripts for the Chandler Halderson case. I'm also working on Gabby Petito, as well as Colonel Russell Williams. And I recognize that those are all cases that a lot of people are already familiar with. But I want to continue to earn the respect and trust of my audience. I want to continue to show people that I do see things in a different and hopefully unique way that is something that will make people want to continue to come back. And I recognize that I'm not always going to get it right. I'm not always going to see things exactly the way that you do, but I will always make an allowance and make space for you to make the final call in your own mind. My passion is a representation of who I am, but is not an absolute. I'm not ever telling you that this is the only way to see it. I'm simply telling you that that's the way I see it. And it's one of the reasons that I am so excited. One of the cases that I'm most looking forward to telling and writing is the Melissa Lucio case. In a lot of ways, her case is very similar to Darlie Routier's, in the sense that there is a very split community concerning the viewpoint of whether or not she's guilty or innocent. To those unfamiliar, her case is really tragic, to say the least. Long story short, she grew up in a very torn home and eventually would go on to have multiple children. I believe she had a total of 12. I could be wrong. I'll be honest, I don't have the notes here in front of me. To make a long and tragic story short, one of her youngest children fell down a flight of stairs, and police were immediately involved in assuming that she had either pushed or intended for her child to fall down the stairs. In the Amazon Prime documentary, The State of Texas versus Melissa, she is portrayed as a person who is very likely innocent. And in fact, she explains that it was one of her daughters that pushed the child down the stairs. Unfortunately, law enforcement pressured her to give a confession, and she would eventually give in what she says is a false confession. False confessions are a very unfortunate part of the criminal justice system, and they happen all the time. And this element will be a critical part of the analysis that I do in her case. Needless to say, Melissa Lucio was taken to trial and she lost. Now, if I knew nothing about her case, I would assume that at worst she got a secondary manslaughter charge and was in and out of prison in maybe 10, 15, 20 years, I would assume. Especially because all of her children would later testify and say publicly that she was never abusive to any of them at any point ever. Unfortunately, Melissa Lucio was put on death row. And as of just a few days ago, Melissa Lucio and I are communicating. My intention is to tell her story as objectively as I can, but to also tell the truth about what happened. It will likely hit a lot of the same key elements that were present within the Darlie Routier case, even though it is a vastly different case. But her case is one that I personally believe will be one of the most important cases that I have ever or will ever work on. And as I told Melissa, I will tell each of you now. When I was just a toddler, I couldn't have been 18 months yet. I was visiting my grandmother's home in the hometown my mother was from. She had one of those old Victorian homes that were huge and were full of dangerous and massive staircases. My mother had had me and had gotten pregnant with me at the age of 17 years old. My mother was from a very strict Hispanic family, and they were deeply heartbroken at the fact that she had made such an egregious mistake and that she had not lived up to expectations. When we arrived at her mother's home, she told me years later, as I was much older, that she had put things in the way of the basement staircase. Apparently, I was a very rambunctious child and would routinely do things I wasn't supposed to do. And so she said that when she heard me falling down the staircase in the other room, she panicked and just assumed that I was dead. As an adult, I saw the staircase and could not believe that an 18-month-old baby fell down those stairs, and by the time she got to the top of the staircase, she saw me excitedly going back up the stairs to do it again. But when I watched Melissa Lucio's documentary, all I could think was, that could have been my mom. She was in a very conservative part of the Southwest, and had something bad happen to me, they would have treated her no differently. I'll tell you, it never ceases to amaze me the way that I seem to identify with the cases that I talk about. It's not ever intended, and it's not anything that I have ever thought about or planned, and yet it always seems to happen that way. I don't know, you can call me crazy, but I genuinely think that there are just some things that we're meant to do in this life. And for me, this is one of the things I genuinely think that I am meant to do with mine. It's funny, a couple months ago, I was looking through an old hard drive from almost 10 years ago now, and I was looking at all the various documents that I had saved to it. One of the most common things that I saw in that drive is document after document that I noticed that I would write almost on a monthly basis, where I was telling stories that I would just write down on my breaks or in moments where I just felt inspired to do so. For as long as I can remember, I have always loved telling stories. I have always wanted to do something like this. And that is why I am always so incredibly grateful and express my gratitude the way that I do to you. I realize that I'm incredibly fortunate and blessed to have people like you who have gone so far out of your way to show the support that you have. And I just want to take one more time to say thank you, because it really means the world to me. Now, thankfully, because this podcast is so much easier to do than a normal episode, I will be doing these regularly. I already have the next 5 episodes planned out, including future guests and all kinds of things that will be coming to the podcast, as well as a video version in the future. I won't make promises, but there will be a version that will include video in the future. But for now, I want to leave you with this. When we look at the past 50 years as it relates to various advocacy groups that have come throughout the criminal justice system, when they first started, so many of them were faced with seemingly impossible blocks in their path, things that seemed that they could never overcome. Whether it was the civil rights movement in the 1960s here in America or South African apartheid, there were so many moments in our history that it seemed like things would never change. But in those movements, men and women stood together and realized that the truth and what is right is worth standing for, even if it means having to sacrifice and having to suffer things that most people would avoid. I am just one voice, but because of each of you rallying with me and coming alongside me to stand for these issues, for justice, for victims, and for what is right, together we can accomplish great things. To those of you that have emailed me about the advocacy group, I have added your names to a future newsletter that I'm going to be sending with details about all of what's coming. And believe me, a lot is coming. As I mentioned, the re-edited version of the Chris Watts episode is something I'm working on currently, and I hope to get that done in the next couple of weeks. And yes, it's going to take at least a couple weeks because I have to rewrite so much of the episode. However, you can expect another podcast episode next week. And I promise they're not all just going to be me telling stories and randomly talking about different subjects. At least, I don't think so. But I don't know. It might be. I might just ramble for an entire hour. Who knows? We'll see. But seriously, one last time, thank you so much for taking the time to just be here, for commenting, subscribing, liking, all of those things. If you want to show support, those things make an enormous difference. I'm not kidding. Every time you comment and then share it with someone, even sending it to, yourself in a text message, those things help the algorithm in such a considerable way, and they help me in such a considerable way. So I want to thank you in advance for just being supportive in such a profound way. I still read all of your comments. I do my very level best to respond every chance I get. And to those of you that have supported me from the beginning, I see you. I am so grateful for you, and I cannot wait to see what's in store for us this year. We're just getting started. We have a lot of stuff ahead of us, but some really exciting things to come. So thank you for your time today, and I look forward to doing this again really soon. We'll be able to communicate more often because I'm doing this, and I just can't wait to share with you all the stuff that I have planned. So, as always, this has been the Behind Criminal Minds podcast. We'll see you next time.